You gave me a chance when no one else would.
I don't know what to say.
6 months ago, she fired him for leaving a crucial board meeting to take his sick daughter to the emergency room. Today, her billionaire empire is ashes. Her bank accounts are completely frozen, and the only person standing between her and the abyss is the single father she ruthlessly discarded. Cardboard carries a distinct, dry smell when it's freshly folded. It smells like dust, wood pulp, and abrupt endings. Camille dragged the edge of a packing tape dispenser across the bottom flaps of a medium-sized box. The harsh, ratcheting screech of the adhesive tearing from the roll echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office. The sound was too loud. It gnawed at the silence that had settled over the 72nd floor of the Westgate building, a building that, as of 9 a.m. this morning, no longer belonged to her. She stood up, smoothing the front of her charcoal wool blazer. It was a custom weave from Milan, costing more than the average car, yet it suddenly felt thin, abrasive against her skin. Her hands, usually steady enough to point a laser pointer at a plunging quarterly graph without a tremor, were trembling slightly. She pressed her palms flat against the cool, polished expanse of her mahogany desk to steady them. The bankruptcy hearing had concluded an hour ago. There was no screaming, no dramatic gavel pounding, just a judge with tired eyes and a stack of manila folders, speaking in a monotone drone that formally dissolved 12 years of ruthless, unyielding corporate conquest. Her board of directors had jumped ship 3 weeks prior, selling her out to a hostile private equity firm to save their own golden parachutes. She looked around the room. What does a person pack when they lose an empire? She bypassed the framed magazine covers. Forbes, Fortune, Time. Her face plastered on them, chin tilted up, eyes sharp, hailed as the undisputed queen of venture capital. They were heavy, encased in thick glass. She didn't want the weight. She didn't want the mocking stare of her past self, the woman who thought she was invincible. Instead, she reached for a small, heavy brass paperweight shaped like a bull. It was cold to the touch. She dropped it into the cardboard box. It landed with a dull, final thud. Next went a high-end fountain pen. The ink crusted around the nib. Then, a pair of spare reading glasses. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside, perfectly aligned, were her emergency supplies. A pair of flat shoes, a sealed bottle of expensive scotch, a silver compact mirror. She took the mirror and opened it. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across her face. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back in a severe, flawless twist, had a stray strand hanging limp against her cheek. The skin under her eyes was bruised with exhaustion, a deep, hollow purple. She snapped the compact shut and tossed it in the box. The door clicked open. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't look up. "The liquidators are on the floor below, Miss Westgate," a voice said. It was one of the security guards. She didn't know his name. She had never bothered to learn the names of anyone below director level. "Give me 2 minutes," Camille said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a low, raspy contralto that betrayed none of the panic vibrating in her chest. "They asked me to take your keycard now, ma'am." Camille finally turned. The guard stood awkwardly in the doorway, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. He wasn't looking at her face. He was staring at the space just left of her shoulder. 33, 3, 33, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. He looked embarrassed for her. That, more than the judge's ruling, made her stomach violently contract. She hated pity. It tasted like rust in the back of her throat. She reached into her blazer pocket, retrieved the heavy black key card with its embedded gold chip, and walked over to him. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it onto the glass coffee table nearby. It landed with a sharp clack. "Keep the change," she muttered, picking up her cardboard box. Walking to the elevator felt like wading through wet cement. The open-plan trading floor, usually a chaotic symphony of ringing phones and shouting analysts, was a ghost town. Computer monitors were powered down, staring back like dead, black eyes. A stray piece of printer paper tumbled across the gray carpet, pushed by the draft of the air conditioning. She pressed the elevator button with her elbow. The doors slid open instantly. As she stepped inside and the metal doors closed, cutting her off from the life she had built, a sudden, suffocating tightness gripped her chest. She couldn't breathe. The air in the elevator felt recycled, stale, devoid of oxygen. She leaned back against the mirrored wall, the edge of the cardboard box digging painfully into her ribs. She was 38. She had $42 in her wallet. Her offshore accounts were frozen by the SEC. Her penthouse on the Upper East Side was locked behind a bank seal. She had burned every bridge, stepped on every mentor, and alienated every friend to get to the top. Now she was at the bottom, and there was no net. The elevator chimed at the lobby. Camille straightened her spine, locked her jaw, and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, the smell of hot asphalt and city garbage hitting her in a suffocating wave. She didn't look back at the building. She just started walking. The neon sign outside the window flickered with a persistent, annoying hum. It cast a sickly red glow through the sheer, dusty curtains of the motel room. It was a cheap place in a neighborhood she would previously only view from the tinted windows of her town car. The room smelled of old dampness, heavily masked by artificial pine cleaner. Camille sat on the edge of a mattress that sagged violently in the middle. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, rough and stiff under her fingertips. She stared at the cracked screen of her personal laptop, the only electronic device the lawyers couldn't legally seize. She hit refresh on her banking portal. Available balance, $0. She hit refresh again, as if the pixels might magically rearrange themselves into the 8-figure sum she was accustomed to seeing. Available balance, $0. A dry, bitter laugh scraped its way out of her throat. It wasn't funny, but her brain didn't know how else to process the absolute totality of her ruin. Hunger, sharp and persistent, gnawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Grabbing her purse, she left the room, making sure the flimsy lock clicked shut behind her. She walked 2 blocks to a 2-4-hour diner. The air inside was thick with the smell of burnt coffee, frying grease, and cheap maple syrup. The linoleum floor was sticky under her expensive leather soles. She slid into a vinyl booth in the back corner. The vinyl was cracked, the foam underneath exposed and crumbling. A waitress with tired eyes and a stained apron approached, slapping a laminated menu down. Coffee? Black. And a piece of dry toast, Camille said, keeping her head down. As the waitress walked away, Camille's eyes drifted to the booth across the aisle. A father was sitting there with a little girl. The girl was maybe 6, coloring furiously on a paper placemat with a stubby crayon. The father was looking at her with a soft, exhausted smile, wiping a smudge of ketchup from her cheek with a napkin. Camille's breath hitched. A cold spike of memory drove itself directly into her temple. David. She closed her eyes, the ambient noise of clinking silverware and murmuring patrons fading into a dull roar. 6 months ago, the boardroom had smelled of expensive citrus polish and fear. The quarterly projections were down. Camille was pacing at the head of the table, systematically tearing into her risk assessment team. David had been sitting near the middle. He was a senior analyst, quiet, brilliant with numbers, but he always looked like he needed a good night's sleep. His phone, resting on the mahogany table, lit up. Then it vibrated. Then it rang. In Camille's boardroom, a ringing phone was a cardinal sin. She stopped pacing. She turned her icy blue gaze on him. The entire room collectively held its breath. David had fumbled for the phone, his face draining of color. He looked at the screen and absolute panic washed over his features. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I have to take this," he stammered, his voice cracking. "It's the school nurse. My daughter. She has severe asthma. She's having an attack. I have to go to the hospital." Camille hadn't blinked. She didn't feel a shred of empathy. She only saw an interruption. She only saw weakness. "We are in the middle of a restructuring matrix, David," she had said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "Miss Westgate, please." She can't breathe. He was already gathering his laptop, his hands shaking violently. He smelled of nervous sweat and stale coffee. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back," Camille had stated, the words flat, devoid of any emotion. David had frozen. He looked at her. truly looked at her, his brown eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and utter revulsion. He didn't argue, he didn't plead, he just turned and practically ran out of the room. Camille had simply nodded to the head of HR, process his severance, terminate him with cause, job abandonment, and then she went right back to the projections. Sitting in the diner now, the memory didn't make her cry. It just made her feel entirely, hollowly alone. Her ruthlessness had built her empire, yes, but when the walls cracked, there was no one standing beside her to help hold up the ceiling. She had engineered her own isolation. "Here you go, hon." Camille jumped slightly as the waitress slid a chipped white mug of coffee and a small plate with toast onto the table. The coffee sloshed over the brim, a dark, bitter puddle forming on the formica. Camille forced the dry toast down her throat. It tasted like sawdust. She drank the coffee, letting the scalding liquid burn her tongue. She needed to feel something other than the crushing weight of failure. When the bill came, it was for $4.50. Camille reached into her wallet and pulled out her only remaining credit card. She placed it on the small plastic tray. 2 minutes later, the waitress returned. Her expression was flat, unsympathetic. Cards declined. Camille froze. The blood rushed to her ears, a deafening swoosh. "Can you run it again? The chip can be faulty." "I ran it 3 times. It's dead." The waitress crossed her arms, shifting her weight. "You have cash?" Camille looked in her wallet. She had used her last cash for the motel deposit. A deep, burning flush of humiliation crept up her neck, spreading across her cheeks. The absolute indignity of it. She had authorized billion-dollar mergers, and now she was trapped over $4.50. Her hands moved mechanically. She unclasped the heavy silver Rolex from her left wrist. It was worth $15,000. She set it gently on the table next to the bill. The metal made a soft clink against the plastic tray. "Keep it," Camille said, her voice hollow. The waitress looked at the watch, then at Camille, her brows furrowed in deep suspicion. "I can't take a fake watch for a bill." "It's real. Just take it." Camille slid out of the booth, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't wait for a response. She practically fled the diner, bursting out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as if she had been submerged underwater. The city at 2 a.m. possessed a cruel kind of beauty. The yellow glow of street lamps reflected off the damp pavement. Distant sirens wailed, a constant, mournful underscore to the city's pulse. Camille walked for hours. Her custom leather heels, designed for plush boardroom carpets and short walks to luxury vehicles, were now rubbing her heels raw. Every step was a sharp, stinging reminder of her descent. She eventually found herself in a small concrete plaza near the financial district. It was ironic, returning to the scene of the crime. The towering glass skyscrapers loomed overhead, dark monoliths scraping the starless sky. She sat down on a cold, concrete bench. The chill of the stone seeped instantly through her wool trousers, biting into her skin. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She was so tired. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was a bone-deep weariness, a profound desire to simply stop fighting. She had spent her entire adult life clawing, manipulating, and dominating. The engine that drove her the pure, unadulterated need to win had seized up. The tank was empty. She looked at the subway grate a few yards away, watching the wisps of steam curl into the cold air. She wondered, with a frighteningly calm detachment, what it would take to just disappear completely. Footsteps broke the silence. They weren't the hurried, erratic steps of a late-night wanderer. They were steady, measured, approaching her from the left. Camille didn't turn her head. She tightened her grip on her purse, bracing herself. A shadow fell over the pavement in front of her, cast by the street lamp behind the bench. "They said you lost everything." The voice was masculine, calm, and achingly familiar. Camille flinched, the muscles in her neck locked. She turned her head slowly. Standing a few feet away, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thick canvas jacket, was David. He didn't look like the terrified, sweating man she had fired 6 months ago. He looked grounded. He wore dark jeans and practical boots. The perpetual exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, observant stillness. Camille's defense mechanisms, honed over decades of corporate warfare, engaged instantly. Her spine snapped straight. She lifted her chin, layering a mask of haughty indifference over her shattered pride. "David," she said, her voice dripping with artificial frost, "come to gloat? Have the paparazzi hired you as a scout?" David didn't bite. He didn't look angry or smug or vindictive. He just looked at her, his eyes taking in her wrinkled designer suit, the hollows of her cheeks, the exhausted slump of her shoulders that she was trying so desperately to hide. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's a public bench," she snapped, staring straight ahead. He sat down on the opposite end of the concrete slab. He left a wide berth of space between them. The smell of clean laundry detergent and faint cedar drifted from his jacket. It was a normal, human smell. It stood in stark contrast to the stale cigarette smoke and garbage odor of the city. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind rattled the bare branches of a nearby tree. "Lily is doing well, by the way," David said quietly. "My daughter." The hospital managed to stabilize her airway that day. It was close. Camille closed her eyes, swallowing hard. The metallic taste of guilt flooded her mouth. "I don't need a guilt trip, David. I have nothing left for you to sue me for. I'm not here for a lawsuit, Camille." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. It jolted her. In the office, it was always Miss Westgate, uttered with respect or fear or both. David pulled his right hand out of his jacket pocket. Between his index and middle finger, he held a single, crisp, rectangular piece of paper. The street lamp caught the faint watermarks on the security paper. He leaned forward slightly and slid the paper across the cold concrete, stopping it exactly halfway between them. Camille looked down. It was a check. From a bank, she recognized an exclusive private tier bank. The signature at the bottom was David's, written in bold, confident blue ink. But the pay to the order of line was blank, and the numeric box was blank. Camille stared at it. The edges of the paper fluttered slightly in the night breeze. Her brain, usually capable of processing complex financial data in milliseconds, stalled out entirely. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice betrayed her, trembling just at the edges. "It's exactly what it looks like," David said, his tone entirely matter-of-fact. Camille's pride flared up like a dying ember hit with pure oxygen. She let out a harsh, bitter scoff. "Is this a joke? You start a GoFundMe for the Wicked Witch of Wall Street? Or did you scrape together a few $1,000s just so you could experience the thrill of watching me beg for it?" David sighed, a soft, tired sound. "After you fired me, I took a risk. I started my own boutique risk management firm. I had nothing to lose. Ironically, working under you for 4 years taught me exactly how to spot structural weaknesses in mid-cap tech firms. I shorted 3 companies that were built on the same hollow metrics your board was using." He paused, looking at the city skyline. It paid off. Substantially. Camille stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He wasn't poor. He wasn't struggling. He was successful, and he was sitting here, offering her a lifeline. It made absolutely no sense to her. It violated every rule of the brutal universe she inhabited. "Why?" she demanded, turning to fully face him, her eyes burning with angry, unshed tears. "I ruined your career. I didn't care if your child lived or died. I treated you like garbage. Why are you handing me a blank check?" David turned to meet her gaze. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only a profound, grounded understanding. "Because," David said softly, the sound of the rustling paper echoing in the space between them, "I remember exactly what it feels like to be completely powerless, watching your whole world collapse, while someone looks at you and feels nothing. And I decided a long time ago that I would never be that person." He stood up, the canvas of his jacket rustling. "Fill it out, Camille. Get a lawyer. Get a decent meal. Start over." He looked down at her one last time. Just build something better this time. David turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the heavy, damp air of the city night, leaving Camille sitting alone in the cold, staring at a small piece of paper that weighed heavier than any empire she had ever owned. Morning arrived not with a gentle glow, but with the abrasive scrape of garbage trucks and the choking smell of diesel exhaust. Camille had not moved from the concrete bench. The damp chill of the night had seeped deep into her joints, leaving her stiff and aching. Her expensive wool blazer was completely ruined, crusted with city grime along the hem. In her right hand, cramped and frozen in a tight claw, she still held the blank check. The security paper was slightly warped now from the moisture of her palm. She stared at the blank line. Her brain, trained to maximize leverage and extract every possible cent from a deal, screamed at her to write 5 million, 10 million. Enough to immediately crush Archer Donovan, the mentor who had orchestrated the boardroom coup. Enough to buy back her penthouse, hire a legal army, and burn the Westgate building to the ground. But her stomach turned violently at the thought. Taking David's money was a humiliation so profound it physically hurt. It felt like swallowing ground glass. Writing a fortune on this paper would prove everything Archer and the board had said about her, that she was a parasite, a hollow shell of ambition incapable of standing on her own. Camille forced her stiff legs to move. She walked 4 blocks to a commercial bank branch. The heavy glass doors unlocked exactly at 9. The air inside was aggressively conditioned, smelling of floor wax and ozone from the copy machines. She walked up to the teller window. The young man behind the glass wore a slightly crooked name tag and a look of deep boredom. He glanced at her wrinkled suit, her smudged makeup, and his expression tightened into subtle suspicion. "I need a pen," Camille said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. The teller slid a cheap, blue plastic ballpoint under the security partition. Camille pressed the check against the cool laminate of the counter. The pen felt flimsy, completely weightless compared to her custom Mont Blanc. She didn't hesitate. She didn't let her ego intervene. She wrote 15,000.00. 15,000. It was an insultingly small amount in her former world. It was a rounding error on her weekly expense reports. But right now, it was a roof. It was a cheap laptop. It was food that didn't come from a diner's cracked plastic tray. She slid the check back under the glass. "Cash, please." The teller examined the signature, then the amount. He typed rapidly on his keyboard. A minute passed. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Camille's pulse pounded in her ears. What if he canceled it? What if this was a trick? "I'll need to verify the funds on an account this size, ma'am," the teller said neutrally. He picked up a desk phone. Camille stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the counter. She focused on the grain of the faux wood. 3 minutes later, the teller hung up. He didn't say a word. He just opened a drawer, counted out 150 crisp $100 bills, banded them, and pushed them under the glass. They smelled like starch and old ink. Camille shoved the money deep into her coat pocket. She walked out of the bank and immediately hailed a cab. By noon, she had secured a short-term lease on a tiny third-floor walk-up in Queens. The hallway smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and old shoes. The apartment itself was a barren square of scuffed hardwood and peeling beige paint. The radiator hissed and clanked, a violent metallic rhythm. She bought a mid-range laptop from an electronics store, a prepaid burner phone, and a legal pad. She sat on the floor, she hadn't bought a chair, and opened the laptop. For the next 3 days, Camille did not sleep. She barely ate, surviving on instant black coffee and stale crackers. Her eyes burned, bloodshot and dry, as she scoured public SEC filings, shell company registrations, and offshore trust documents. Archer Donovan was a shark, but he was an old shark. He relied on archaic structures to hide his liabilities. When he orchestrated the hostile takeover of Westgate Capital, he had absorbed her portfolio to cover a massive, bleeding hole in his own real estate ventures. Camille knew his patterns. She had spent a decade studying him, learning his tells, absorbing his cruelty until it became her own. She tracked the money. She followed the digital breadcrumbs through layers of dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. On the night of the 3rd day, the radiator clanking loudly behind her, Camille stopped typing. She stared at a PDF document from a subsidiary holding company. There it was. The fatal flaw. Archer had cross-collateralized the pension funds of 2 separate acquisitions to secure the bridge loan for his buyout of her company. It was highly illegal. It was federal prison territory, and the digital signature authorizing the transfer belonged directly to Archer. Camille closed the laptop. The fan whirred softly, dying down. She lay back on the hard, dusty floorboards, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. A slow, terrifyingly cold smile spread across her face. It wasn't the smile of a billionaire CEO. It was the smile of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. 4 weeks later, The air inside the lobby of the Donovan Group headquarters was perfectly calibrated to 72 degrees. It smelled of imported white tea and money. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting the harsh, geometric lines of the modern art hanging on the walls. Camille sat in a low-slung leather chair near the elevator bank. She wore a charcoal suit. It wasn't Milan wool. It was off the rack from a mid-tier department store, tailored sharply by a dry cleaner in Queens to fit her frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple, severe ponytail. She carried a single, unmarked manila folder. The private executive elevator chimed softly. Archer Donovan stepped out. He was a tall man, impeccably groomed, with silver hair and eyes that lacked any discernible warmth. He was laughing softly with his chief legal counsel, a young man who looked hungry and nervous. Camille stood up. She didn't block his path. She just stepped into his peripheral vision and waited. Archer stopped mid-laugh. The color drained from his face with shocking speed, leaving his skin a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at her as if she had crawled out of a grave. "Archer," Camille said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the manic energy that used to characterize her boardroom brawls. "Camille." He recovered quickly, adjusting his silk tie. A patronizing smirk touched the corners of his mouth. "Security is usually tighter. How did you get past the desk? Looking for an analyst position? I hear you're liquidating your assets. I need 5 minutes. In your office," she said. "I'm afraid my schedule is entirely—" Camille didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, bridging the gap between them, and murmured 3 words: "Cypress Holdings, pension." Archer's smug expression shattered. His jaw muscles tightened so hard she could hear the faint click of his teeth. He turned to his lawyer. "Give us 10 minutes. The corner office was almost identical to the one she had lost, just a few blocks north. Archer walked behind his massive glass desk, but didn't sit. He crossed his arms. "What do you want, Camille? A payout? You have no leverage. You were voted out legally." Camille dropped the manila folder onto the center of his pristine glass desk. It landed with a dull slap. "I don't want a payout," she said, pacing slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked out at the city grid. "I want my core tech patents back. The algorithmic trading software I built before you absorbed me. And I want the non-compete clause in my exit contract nullified." Archer scoffed, though it sounded weak. "Those patents are the only things keeping Westgate Capital afloat. They are worth hundreds of millions." "They are," Camille agreed, turning to face him, "but they aren't worth 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and pension embezzlement." She nodded toward the folder. "I traced the Cyprus transfers. I have the digital authorizations. I have copies of the ledger on a secure drive set to email the SEC, the FBI, and the Wall Street Journal if I don't enter a passcode every 12 hours. Archer stared at the folder. He didn't reach for it. He knew exactly what was inside. "You'll destroy the company," he hissed. "You'll destroy your own legacy." "I don't care about the company anymore," Camille said. The realization felt surprisingly light. "It's infected. You infected it. Keep the real estate. Keep the bloated subsidiaries. Keep the toxic board that stabbed me in the back. But the algorithm is mine. Transfer the IP rights to a holding company I've established, dissolve the non-compete, and I bury the Cypress files." Archer placed his hands flat on the desk, leaning forward. His eyes burned with hatred. "You're a monster, Camille." "You taught me well, Archer," she replied softly. "Have the paperwork drawn up by 3 o'clock. She didn't wait for his response. She walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut firmly behind her. The neighborhood was entirely different from the financial district. It was loud, chaotic, and aggressively alive. Storefront awnings flapped in the wind. The smell of roasting garlic from a corner bodega mixed with the sharp tang of hot metal from an auto repair shop. Camille checked the address on a small, battered piece of paper. She stopped in front of a modest, 2-story brick building. The sign above the door read, "Miller Risk Management." She pushed the door open. The front office was small. There was a reception desk, currently empty, and a small waiting area with 2 slightly worn fabric chairs. The hum of a server rack buzzed from a back room. David walked out of a side office, carrying a stack of printed reports. He stopped dead when he saw her. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just looked surprised. Camille stood in the center of the room. For the first time in her adult life, she felt entirely exposed. She didn't have the armor of her title. She didn't have a billion-dollar valuation protecting her. She was just a woman in a cheap suit. She reached into her purse and pulled out a cashier's check. She walked over to the reception desk and set it down. $16,500, Camille said, her voice quiet but steady. Principal of $15,000 plus 10% interest for the month. It's a standard short-term mezzanine rate. David walked slowly toward the desk. He looked at the check, then up at her. You took 15? It was all I needed, she said. She crossed her arms, rubbing the fabric of her sleeve. It was rough, itchy. I got my core tech back. I started a new firm. It's small. Just me and a laptop in a kitchen in Queens. But it's mine, and it's clean. David nodded slowly. Good. The silence hung between them, thick with the weight of their shared history. Camille looked down at the industrial carpeting. This was the hard part, the part she had never practiced. You were right, she said, the words feeling foreign and jagged in her mouth, about the weakness in the old firm. The metrics were hollow. I was so focused on expanding the perimeter, I didn't see the rot in the foundation. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. And I was wrong. About you. About that day in the boardroom. It was the closest she had ever come to an apology. It felt incredibly inadequate. David looked at her for a long, silent moment. His eyes were entirely unreadable. Then, he reached down and picked up the cashier's check. He folded it neatly in half and slipped it into his pocket. Apology accepted, he said quietly. He didn't offer her a smile. He didn't offer her forgiveness wrapped in a neat, cinematic bow. He simply offered her an acknowledgement. A professional reset between two people who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. If you ever need a risk assessment on your new venture, David added, turning back toward his office, my firm's rates are competitive, though we don't work weekends. Family time. Camille felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in her chest. It wasn't the manic thrill of a hostile takeover. It wasn't the icy rush of destroying an enemy. It was something entirely different. It was respect. I'll keep that in mind, Camille said. She turned and walked out the door, stepping back onto the crowded, noisy sidewalk. She didn't have an empire anymore. She didn't have a corner office or a private jet. But as she began the long walk toward the subway, her footsteps were even, steady, and entirely her own. What would you do if the person you hurt the most became your only hope? Camille's journey from absolute ruin to redemption is just beginning. If this story hit you right in the chest, drop a like, share this with someone who loves a comeback, and hit that subscribe button to catch Part 4. Let us know in the comments, does she deserve the blank check?
Hi, my name is Hidden Princess, the owner and manager of Hidden Princess. After watching the video, Bankrupt CEO was ready to give up until the single dad she fired handed her a blank check. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how unexpected grace can completely change someone's direction in life. Daniel had every reason to walk away after being fired, yet he chose compassion instead of bitterness when Olivia hit her lowest point. That quiet act of kindness honestly carried more emotional weight than the money itself. I think the story gently reminds us that people often remember how we treated them during difficult moments far more than during successful ones. Have you ever received help from someone you least expected? And which moment made you realize Daniel still cared despite everything that happened? If this story stayed with you after watching, feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional stories about forgiveness, family, and second chances, you can like or subscribe to support the channel.